Hey everybody, Sayre at Nova again. This week we have a little Kawasaki sport bike action. Recently we had this ELR, Eddie Lawson replica in the background there. And then this week we have just a few years later, a 1987 ZX750. Called a Ninja, as Kawasaki called pretty much everything that had clip-ons and plastic on it. It is a sport bike. It's not quite the spec of the later ZXRs. And it's sort of like, it's an interesting model to work on. It's sort of an intermediate. We talked last time about how this ELR was really bridging the gap between the early first generation superbikes of the 70s and the actual sport bikes, sport built bikes of the 80s. With this still has a tube cradle frame, air-cooled motor, stuff like that. This ZX has a much more advanced motor, liquid cooled, 16 valves, double overhead cams, etc. But if you look at this frame, it's just a built-up version of a steel tube cradle frame, which in 1987 is getting pretty dated. By this point, Honda had box section frames, Suzuki had box section frames, Yamaha had the Delta box frames, and just a few years later, Kawasaki came out and had their own aluminum box section frames. But it's kind of weird because when we took the plastic off this, I don't know this bike terribly well, and I did not expect to see that. It just looks like a basically hotted up KZ1000 almost. Now there's more going on than that. You'll see that the forks have the anti-dive on them, which was hot in the 80s. Even by 87 though, that's getting a little long in the tooth. They kind of had figured that doesn't really do what you want it to do, or when it does, it has so much other downsides that they figured out how to make forks work better rather than adding those things onto it. We do have a box section swing arm at this point, which is getting into that's proper 80s tech. So we're not all alone in the old 70s tech on this one, and it's actually a fairly other than the frame, it's a fairly modern machine all around. Electronic ignition, of course, obviously still carbureted, but fancy up-to-date CV carbs on these things. These are actually flat slide CVKs, which are pretty hot for their time. Let's see what else. It's something else I was going to mention on it. Oh yeah, another oddity of the 80s, the front wheel, 16-inch wheel. Everybody did that for a few years. It didn't work out very well. They thought it would make the bike more agile. It wasn't really worth it, and because they only did it for a few years, this is something to get into when you're getting into classics. The 16-inch tires are really hard to get. There's just not that many of them being made anymore because all the modern stuff is 17. So any 17-inch wheel you can get all day long in any compound you want, and almost any tread you want for a sport bike. And these are just much harder to find. You're very limited in what you can get. So something to bear in mind. Much like when you get into an early Suzuki GSX-R 750 and you find yourself looking for 18-inch sport tires. Not a lot of options out there. Let's see. Other than that, the story with this is actually kind of interesting. I've always been, perhaps to a fault, optimistic about what we can make run. I always like to get things going. I've always thought it's fun to take something that looks like it should never run again and put it back on the road safely and soundly and have many more years of service. But to that end, I've often been a little too optimistic when bikes come in here and saying, oh yeah, that's going to be fine. We can get that going. Turning out that, digging in a little deeper, it's actually pretty rough and probably isn't worth the money to do it. So this one turned out to be kind of an opposite story. This came in, been off the road for a while, and before we got into it, doing due diligence, we did a compression test. We had 30 pounds of compression in cylinder 1, 30 pounds in cylinder 2, maybe 60 in cylinder 3, and 200 in cylinder 4. Not good numbers. And so we decided we'd do a leakdown test to see where it was leaking from. That's when you put air into the cylinder with all the valves closed, and you see if your air is coming out of your intake valve, your exhaust valve, or your past the rings, which means it'll come out of your breather, wherever your breather is on your bike. And we had something like 90% leak down on all but on these two cylinders, and obviously cylinder 4 was fantastic, but and it was coming through the valves and it was coming past the rings, and we said this does not look good. We checked the valve clearances. The clearances were fairly out of spec, and so we we called the customer and said, hey, this isn't really looking great, you know, shall we proceed? And he said, I want this bike to go again. This was a bike that I met my wife on, and et cetera, et cetera. So he said, hopefully it's not so crazy, but let's go. And so we went through the carbs, and amazingly enough, the bike fired right up. And as soon as we ran a little bit, we ran on all 4 cylinders, smoked like a lot, you know, a lot. We'd also put some oil in there so it wouldn't turn over on dry cylinders. And so that stuff burned out. Plus it had, you know, stuck rings, and basically the what was happening with the valves is there's just material in there, corrosion and stuff, holding the valves open. And as soon as it actually starts to run, it closes up again, and that's fine. So doesn't always happen that way. Oftentimes you bring a bike in here and you have 90% leak down, it's not going home without a full rebuild. But this one came right back. So that's kind of a cool, happy story. One other side thing about these valve adjusters, which is kind of cool, and kind of high tech. I'm giving them a little bit of crap for not being high tech enough for their time, but they're rockers, the adjusting rockers. Instead of being basically a seesaw that pivots on something, it is a little. It's basically a ball joint, and it takes basically 30% of the mass off the rockers, so they're far more efficient. And the little ball joint that sits and just gets pushed by the cam, which allows you. It's not as good as direct valve actuation from the cam lobe straight to the valve, but it means they're actually adjustable with a wrench and a screwdriver rather than having to change the shims. So you get kind of the best of both worlds, less of an increase in valve train weight, and still have adjustable valves. So that's kind of cool. I'll give them a nod to that one. And then all in all, it's a fun bike, and it's a great way to have a good time. Goes fast enough to be scary, handles well enough to be all right. I wouldn't want to get in too hot on this frame, but if you look at the later, just 1989, the ZXR came out, and that was a completely different bike, and that was when really Kawasaki was able to come back onto the world stage of racing, and the rest is somewhat history. So yeah, if you have any experience with 80s sport bikes, 80s Kawasaki's in general, but 80s sport bikes, just like the 70s, there's times in the 70s, 80s was really a pivotal time for the arms race of technology. This one a little behind, but they caught up, and it's always fun to look at the details. So if you're watching, please like and subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.